Welcome to the Sense Making in a Changing World podcast, where we explore the kind of thinking we need to navigate a positive way forward. I'm your host, Morag, permaculture educator and global ambassador, filmmaker, eco-villager, food forester, mother, practivist, and all-round lover of thinking, communicating, and acting regeneratively. For a long time, it's been clear to me that to shift trajectory to a thriving one-planet way of life, we first need to shift our thinking. The way we perceive ourselves in relation to nature, self, and community is the core. What better way to make sense than to join together with others in open, generative conversation? In this podcast, I'll share conversations with my friends and colleagues, people who inspire and challenge me in their ways of thinking, connecting, and acting. These wonderful people are thinkers, doers, activists, scholars, writers, leaders, farmers, educators, people whose work informs permaculture and spark the imagination of what a post-COVID, climate-resilient, socially just future could look like. Their ideas and projects help us to make sense in this changing world, to compost and digest the ideas, and to nurture the fertile ground for new ideas, connections, and actions. It's my absolute delight to welcome to the show today Jason Twill. Jason has worked for decades in regenerative urban development. He's a leader in this field of thinking about cities differently and a globally recognised pioneer in innovation, alternative housing, and something that's called regenerative urbanism. He's been the head of sustainability and urban innovation in Lend-Lease. He's a director of Urban Apostles with focuses on city making and the sharing economy. He founded the International Living Future Institute and the originator also of Economics of Change, and has recently created the City Makers Guild. So as I said, it's my absolute delight to welcome Jason today to talk about how we go about creating regenerative cities and what does that look like. So thanks, Jason, for joining me today. Both you and I have been involved in regenerative work for, decades now, but kind of in different worlds and somewhat swirling, but now we kind of meet, and it's really on this theme of regeneration, and that's the basis of my work, and it's the basis, I understand, of your work too, that drives pretty much everything. And so I'm really wanting to dive into what that means. What does a regenerative culture look like? What does a regenerative city look like? I mean, this is kind of the focus, I understand, of your work through Urban Apostles and where you're about to head right now. What is the imperative from your perspective, and what does that kind of world look like?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of adhere to the definition of regeneration being life creating conditions conducive to life, and humanity, or humans, being aligned to and part of the evolutionary process of life, which it's hard to do when you have a Western educated upbringing and lifestyle and consumption patterns and the way we've structured our economies. It's like such a different departure from our current reality. Though that reality is achievable, and I'm hopeful for towards that goal. But it's been, I mean, my connection to the topic is very rooted in my personal life experience, and I have a special affinity for cities because cities kind of saved me from the dull and monotonous living in suburbia in America, and the social patterns that suburbia and the built environment shaped and engendered in the society I grew up in the East Coast of the U.S. So you want me to start there?
Yeah, look, let's. So what does in your mind a regenerative city look like? What are the components of that kind of the living community, the living building, the living culture that you're wanting to engender through regeneration practices and leadership?
I see a city as being an ecosystem. So Ann Whiston Spirn, I got really inspired by her. She's a landscape architect and writer and teacher in the West. I think she's at MIT or UPenn. And she wrote two seminal books one's called The Language of Landscape, and the other one's called The Granite Garden. And He was the first person to help me understand that our cities are nature. It's not like nature in the city or city in nature. Our cities are nature. Everything that's around us comes from nature, and it's just been manipulated by our own vision of what we want, or the way our brains are programmed to want things. So I've always kind of adhered to this ideal that, instead of seeing cities or the built environment as something that the natural world has to be protected from, that it could be the greatest tool we have at regenerating life. And just flipping the coin of how we think about our built infrastructure, our mobility, our buildings, the way we move around, our food systems can all be aligned to adhere to the biophysical realities of our planet and at a bioregional scale. So they're living within the biocapacity of a region. So I see that. And I know it's hard to think about that with supply chains and the global economy, but that's what the world was like for thousands of years. And trade's important to the goods and services going back and forth between bioregions, but the way that humans have inhabited the planet in the last few hundred years, more than that, a couple thousand years, is so out of alignment with living systems and the biophysical reality of our planet. And it just needs to be a wholesale realignment of planning, habitation, and governance around human habitation within bioregions. And I think the bioregion is like the scale I've tried to work at for a long time, from a planning perspective, from a resource management perspective, from movements perspective, whatever it might be. That's like the life shed, and the water catchment is the source of that life. So how do you, if we're not doing things in a way that's regenerating or restoring that water catchment, then we're doing it wrong. And that gets people to think, like I've been trained to have this planetary consciousness, and that's what I've inherited and learned by being mentored by First Nations people. So I can't help but think about, the sphere, the biosphere that we're sitting in when I'm sitting on a table working with architects and engineers and looking at an urban regeneration precinct or a building. I have to think of that bigger scale. It's not just here's the site boundary and I'm plugging into the existing infrastructure. It's like, okay, where is our water coming from? What are the other living systems around here? What are the bird species? What are the flora and fauna? And how do they all correlate to this? And how do we integrate the human system into that in a regenerative way? So it starts with this question of what's working for life first. And then we start the journey of figuring out a design response. So that's very fun.
So I was going to ask you, so how do you then reconcile the notion of scale? So if you're thinking in a bioregional scale, but then we're exploring cities that are just so enormous, and how do we bring those layers back together, and how do we bring that bioregional approach and the richness of that local community connection into a city that is absolutely enormous?
Yeah, I mean, it's looking at the resource flows of cities and mapping that. And like cities can't be islands. Like you can't look at a carbon neutral city. You have to look at a region. Like where does all the food come from? The workers come from? The throughput of a city, the urban flow. Those things need to be like. That's why I'm like a big fan of bioregional governance. Right? Like we should move away from like city states or nation states to bioregion states. And have some kind of cooperative model that allows bioregions to support each other around the world. But it's like aligning to that, the I guess the ecosystem services of a region is probably paramount, and ecosystem services being brought into the urban core in a way that lets us grow food, provides resilience, provides shelter, provides shade, mitigates urban heat island, creates more resilience, all that kind of stuff is paramount. And you're seeing bits and pieces of that with living infrastructure and, vegetated walls, green infrastructure, tree canopy discussions, urban forests are all like steps in the direction for where cities become nature. How we choose our material, how we build our homes. For me, the urban compression is the most important one. So there's a sweet spot for density is another really important one. Cities tend to kind of I'm a big fan of like no more than 8 stories. So I get, that's a bit of a contentious point in the industry right now. I don't believe in sustainable skyscrapers. I think human scale and human connection to Earth is really important. Chris Alexander had a 4-story limit in pattern language. I mean, that's a great pattern, and that's a direct connection of mother and child or parent and child outside. So there's a sweet spot for density that's really important, but the urban compression and the fact that I live in Balmain, there's no garages, just the fact that there's not space allocated to a car for every house compresses the whole urban environment and makes it human scale but hyper walkable. And that I have a lower ecological footprint because I don't need to hop in the car every day. I actually haven't used my car, I don't remember, since the isolation. I have a motorcycle out there that's getting cobwebs on it because I haven't used it. So you don't really, that's a really important point, is the spatial dimensions of urbanization within the context of a bioregion. Those things need to be really well thought through. And unfortunately, the failings of Western society's notions of cities has been copy pasted in developing world. So you just get these, towers, soulless towers stamping into the ground everywhere across the world right now. And they think that's their way of like, we're becoming a world power, we're becoming a global city. And it's like, as soon as I see that, I'm like, you lost the plot because you look like every other city now and nobody's going to want to come visit you. Like, how do you make yourself so distinctively different and responsive to your bioregion, to your cultural context, to your geomorphology, to your human history, that you visualize that history in your built landscape? So you're so unique that you become the only place that you can give that experience to somebody. We're missing that level of thinking in our cities right now.
So within that compressed city landscape, where do you see, or how do you see food, growing food, fit into that and into this bigger city concept? Because something that I'm struggling with a lot at the moment is the notion of the urban food becoming a lot about, vertical walls and more technological food systems, which to me also misses a serious part about that deep connection with soil and mycelium. It's kind of manufactured food, and the nutrient density of it would never be, the aliveness of it would never be what we can get from actually thinking about regenerating soil. So in which way, so how are you working with the kind of the food systems and how that weaves in through your concept of a regenerative city? What are you seeing that's working? And
I mean, there's part of it's about regenerating the soil, and part of it's like social cohesion and people being connected to the soil and the relationships people get around community farms, urban farming. So one is the science of what are the right food systems or food crops that are, resistant to certain urban pollutions or environmental fallout in a city. So I kind of filter that really well. But then looking at every like, a food security and urban farming or urban food strategy for a city that complements the more robust, I guess, periphery urban farming that you have, the farmers markets and farmers coming in. But you could have a series of backyard gardens. I think about World War II when everyone had the little, gardens in the backyard because we had, people had to. I wasn't around back then, but I think about that quite a bit because there's so much space around our homes. And there's a model that was in Seattle that I really liked around distributed farming because I am not a green thumb. Maybe one day I will have the capacity and fortitude to spend time in the backyard. My wife is, I'm not. But I didn't have to be in Seattle because there was a group of people that did that for me. And they would rent out a little space in my backyard and put up raised beds. And I'd have this beautiful urban farm in my backyard, of which maybe 15% of the crop I would get to keep and cook and use with. And then the rest would go to the farmer's market. But they had 50 of those. Vancouver did that, Victoria, British Columbia, Seattle. So you had this like urban farming distribution strategy and it connected people. It connected us to the food system in Seattle, connected us to the farmers, connected to the farmers market, people to grow. So it was a social connection as well.
That's fantastic.
Interventions that are great.
So where then does the idea of compressing the city but still maintaining enough space to have that distributive farming approach? Or is it something where we think actually about, like examples in Horseshoe in Denmark, where a new development's happening and we actually create a farm in the middle, identify which is the best farmland before any development happens, and put that aside as kind of a community farmland trust. And then all the development gets built around that. All the wastewater, waste nutrients go down into the farm. A farmer is employed, or you can volunteer. And so there's this whole farm system that's, and that's kind of a suburb, and it's quite densely urbanized around it. It's brilliant. And I'm thinking, why are those models that integrate food that's actually in the soil rather than an add-on on the edge, something up a wall, where is that happening in the thinking that you're seeing, in and around development? Because, you're in the building industry and you've seen in many different countries and many different cities, and you're talking to, I'm more sort of like a bottom-up, community-led permaculture eco-village background, whereas you've come from the building industry. Like, where are these meeting? Where is that place where we can actually bring those
concepts in the peri-urban sense? So when the urban areas, any urban regeneration project we're dealing with, there's community gardens. Councils have been really good about, freeing up public land, supporting community gardens in the city. We have a beautiful community garden right down here. It's gorgeous. So there's a lot of the integration happening, interventions into cities. But there's a huge movement, it's called Agroburbia, or food-centered suburbs, where they start with the farm and they build a community around the farm. And that's been a massive movement across North America. And you have some really incredible examples of how that's manifested. There's even a company in Colorado that consults globally on that, doing work in China now. So food is such a strong connection point for people, like the proverbial breaking bread. And it creates this maybe not genuine farm village community from the past, but it creates a deeper sense of authenticity around community and how food creates an epicenter for community. And I think there's a project in Georgia, I'm forgetting the name of it, Serenbe. So Serenbe is it's kind of bourgeois, but it's like beautiful architecture centered around farming in hillside farms around Georgia. Very, very beautifully done. So beauty is a very important part of this story, because that, if it's beautiful, people will fight to keep it in their years. That's sustainable in my mind. But food is is the driving force for these communities. So there is the active working farms. I'm really inspired by my generation, a lot younger than me, maybe Gen X. I'm Gen X, Gen Y. There's been such a huge move towards permaculture and towards farming. People just aren't chasing that Wall Street job or chasing to be lawyers and doctors. There's so much more increased interest in going back to the land and setting up farms. I saw that in real time when I was living in Seattle and going to the Bullock Permaculture Institute. And they was churning out all these crazy, cool people that were going to set up farms in Vashon Island or in the Western Washington and setting up new organic farms all over the country. So it's a good movement because it's people getting back to more core ways of living as people, as humans, and being connected to the land. And the ones inspired by Wendell Berry and what's his name, Jackson.
What?
Who's the really cool?
Where's Jackson? You're trying to.
Not Jackson, yeah. That they've inspired a whole generation of people, a younger generation going back to farming, and the regen agriculture space is massive. So it's like having regen, bringing yourself, someone like you, into the urban regeneration conversation, right? We tend to get into these siloed specialist roles, and you're managing projects like that, and it's the very technical engineering, architecture. And I learned from Janine Benyus, bring a biologist to the table, a marine biologist to the table, a permaculture or culture ecologist table. It completely changes the dimensions of the design team and how they're going to respond. And I did a lot of that in Seattle. I haven't seen a lot of that here in Australia. But that's a huge opportunity for how we look at regenerative agriculture playing a role in regeneration of cities.
Yeah, absolutely. And It's so I mean, I think, like you're saying, and not much is happening here in Australia in that space, little bits on the edge, and there still seems to be quite a split between the kind of the permaculture approach and the citizen design approach, and then there's the the urban design and development model, and there's still not much meeting happening. There's a few projects I've been involved in and sitting at the table of these developments, but mostly we're not even on the menu, let alone at the table. So where does that change happen? Like how and where can that change happen? And right now, actually, in this moment, we're speaking as part of this lockdown with the pandemic. It's just starting to open up a bit, but globally, like what has shifted and how can this moment actually help us to shift things further and to sort of, I don't know that word, myceliate this conversation much more widely to help to flip into the changes that we need to happen now. Like, how is this moment to accelerate that?
We're in this really historic moment in human history with, we're all globally connected right now through this one crisis. And we in Australia particularly feel like we've been in crisis for a few months before this hit because of drought, massive drought, and bushfires that were a result of that drought. So resilience is a really key issue, and I think that's a term we use quite a bit, but maybe the context of that changes given the people have now experienced the issue of going through something like this and not having access to toilet paper. How resilient are we if we can't get certain goods and services that we need? And what is the mindset of the culture that wants to hoard things? So permaculture, I think, can be a really interesting way to rethink how we rebound out of this and really look at urban scale permaculture initiatives and how do we create those regional resilient bioregions kind of thing. That's the conversation we're trying to have yesterday. Like that's the global dialogue right now that we're having with Commonwealth. Because I get news from the councillors all the time about food security, this issue going on. This has tested the limits, and Sydney's about to come out with their COVID-19, response strategy or rebound strategy. So it's making sure that things like permaculture, like regenerative development, like biophilia, like biomimicry, advanced sustainability, moving beyond Green Star is on the agenda. And really, how do you think about matching our urban strategy to the science and magnitude of the challenge we're facing? Be it climate change, be it social equity, be it water scarcity, be it extreme weather events, be it, rising sea level, whatever it might be, that we have to start building our cities that match the magnitude and the science of the problem, because we're not. We're making incremental change.
So with what I've experienced over the last few decades of being involved in permaculture, and also, more recently, where I really feel that there's an intense depth of knowledge and understanding and experience in creating living systems, living communities, but yet I still feel like there's this block for it being heard or being brought into the conversations or being able to ripple out into news for it to actually be part of the conversation for people to hear. How would you go about trying to get permaculture heard more, I suppose? I mean, your experience in the States, I think, is you're saying that it is actually rippling out a lot more, but it still feels quite, even though it's emerged out of Australia, it still feels like it's quite marginal. I know the edge is a very fertile place to be, but I think there's something about where we are right now that we need to be able to bring it further into this conversation that's being had about where to now, how do we bounce forward, not snap back.
Yeah, and I think, America, I wouldn't say America's like 6 countries in one, right? And, while we were doing some really good stuff in New York, like when I moved to Seattle and Portland and Vancouver, the Pacific Northwest was like exponentially farther ahead. And that's where I saw real things happening. So there's a cultural underlayment to the embracing of this Germany is one of those countries, northern Europe, because it's just ingrained in their culture. You don't want to be the asshole driving to the party in BMW, right? They've evolved and matured their understanding of sustainability into a cultural mainstream norm. Where if you're living in Seattle, you better be wearing something local or organic, eating organic food, or doing something for the planet, or you're just kind of irrelevant. It's just like, so there is kind of the status quo mentality. I don't see that here. I hop on a flight from Seattle to Portland and land here, and it's like the slick, global corporate boom. It's a very corporatized country. So to penetrate transformation in this country, you need to get into the boardroom. And there's such a dominance of corporate. Every city has their four big banks, or their four big corporations, their four big developers, and it's like, boom. It's been amazing and impressive growth on an island, continent like this, but it's very corporatized. And the whole country has this corporate green strategy that's been set up by these trade organizations and corporations so they can pat themselves on the back for mediocre outcomes like Green Star 5, right? Which isn't really true sustainability. Yes, it's amazing accomplishment of what Green Star has been able to do, but it's not driving transformation the way it needs to at the pace it needs to, particularly given the fragility of Australian resources. Not mining resources, but food and water, like life-sustaining resources. So it's penetrating that, and you have glimpses of that, like Fraser is doing that living building mall, right? So they've embraced something, but it's more to do probably with competition and setting themselves. They set a new benchmark though, and if they continue to drive that, that's really important to move the needle. But I think Australia needs to get past this risk-averse sustainability mindset and really start to unlock true transformational outcomes and the full potential of what Australian industry and communities can do. Because I do see, even when I first came down here, I first saw like the eco village and all that stuff is just the fringe stuff in the rural environments of the country, and hasn't really made its way into how we're rethinking community in cities. And it's an urbanized country, so that's hugely important for this country. So it's getting into the planning regimes of the state. The state operates more like a corporation than a government in my mind, or like just the way they talk about their citizens as customers. That just gets there's a bit of a blurred line between industry and government here, which also concerns me. And I also see there's a lack of trust with government, and that's a huge problem. You have to trust your government. And I would say that, just even dealing with COVID-19, the mixed messaging from the federal to the state level is crazy. But I think because of the mishandling of the bushfires, that there was a really good response to handling COVID-19. So I do commend for how they handled COVID-19. But, we can't lose sight. It reminds me of the GFC, right? So when everything was like shovel-ready projects that were bad for the environment, like highways and other stuff that was just shelved just to get save the economy and get the economy back, in growth-centric mode. Everything went out the door, but those are projects that were purposely shelved because they were bad for the environment. And we can't just snap back into that, right? It's like psychologically, up until, this is the US thing, like Obama became president, and leading up to that, like climate change and climate legislation was like top of the list, right? In all these surveys. And we had all this momentum to get a cap and dividend thing through the government. You remember some of the bills that were going through. We were paying attention to what was happening down here as well. And then, the economy collapsed and climate change went all the way down the bottom of the list, and jobs became number one. And all the decision making was based on that short term and short sighted. So we need to get into that space again around, super long term thinking and making sure that climate change, regenerative development is always top of the list no matter what. Like those are the truths of what we have to stay adhering to no matter what happens. It's really hard for politicians to do that because they're only in it for 2 years, 3 years, and I
And
just
now,
hate to say the
and now with
derivative.
this situation too that we're in, there's priorities are shifting. So from your perspective, with the kind of work that you've been doing, has your perspective on what's kind of the urgent imperative work that we need to be doing right now shifted since we've entered into this pandemic? Because I know that, we're only just entered into, it's kind of like there's a marathon and we've only started the first mile. We've got a big recovery ahead. So have you reoriented how you're thinking about your work, or is it just
It's
continue?
validated.
What was that? Sorry?
It's just these issues and crises we're dealing with. It's just validating why we do what we do. I mean, we're doing this because we know these things are coming and they're going to get more frequent, more pervasive, more disastrous. The science has been there before I was born. We know this stuff. I mean, limits of growth, 1972, like Dana Meadows, like even before that, Rachel Carson. There's a lineage here that we are part of that, and I've been dealing with the climate scientists for a long time, and they're scared shitless. Like, we know these things are going to happen, right? And they're happening more frequently and probably sooner than we anticipated, but we knew they were going to happen. So I'm not surprised by these events. Mm-hmm. I'm studying how they're manifesting, how people are responding to them, but I've always been early on focused on economic transformation, the things that govern human decision making and govern our societal behaviors and habits. We have a completely broken economic system that was born out of the Great World War II events that restructured geopolitics in the world. And the model of the macroeconomic theory came about when people at the time saw nature as free and limitless. And obviously that's not the case. We saw the friction between that model when Rachel Carson wrote Silent Spring and the problems of externalities. So we need a new economic model for humanity, but that's predicated also on the politics of humanity, the political ideology that informs that, and the values and belief systems that inform that political ideology. So there's this massive shift. I mean, when 2012 happened, right, and I'm a huge fan of Mesoamerican culture and history, and on the Aztec calendar, Mayan, long cant calendar, when 2012 is supposed to be the end of the world, I always saw it as this evolution of human consciousness and a shifting of human consciousness. And I can see that. Even the conversation we had yesterday with the group and the different perspectives, if you look at the patterns across humanity right now, I am extremely hopeful. And I've been trained to be seeing the glasses overflowing because I can't fall into morass or the abyss of, not uncertainty, but catastrophe. I can't have that, right? I have to have deep hope in humanity, and that we will shift our consciousness to create the kind of world, where all life thrives. So, but there needs to be the economic structure and an interim that helps us shift and helps that a consciousness grow within us. That's why I've been working with Stuart for so long, so that genuine progress indicators, a difference from GDP. Mm-hmm. Creating a world of internalities, that there is no such thing as throwing something away because we have one biosphere, one planet. Our economic models have to match the biophysical reality of this. And you go back to the physiocrats in France in like the 1700s, they were thinking that. They were trying to do that stuff back then. Biophysical economic theory came from like French salons in the 1700s. And that kept on getting, because of power struggle and, the haves always pushed that down because they knew they'd have less with those kind of models. So the tension that was brought up yesterday is a really important one on the power struggle that we have to face.
So you've mentioned a lot that since you've been here in Australia, that what you've learned from Indigenous Australia has opened up and informed so much more of what you do. So, talking about, bioregional planning or economic models or governance models and community, in what ways, that's a very big question, but, in essence, how has that informed what you do and maybe changed your perception on regeneration work?
Yeah, wow, I should have acknowledged country before I started, but yeah, I want to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and my adopted family, the Namba Bugga Bugga people of the Gambanger Nation, which is where Charles is from. So yeah, I have, I've been through so much training, mentoring by incredible people in the world, like all of our friends and family out there in the big movement. And I could say being in Australia for 7 years and having that connection to country and being mentored by someone like Chels and her peers has been profoundly more valuable and more insightful and shifting my perspective on the world and my own ontology about my relationship to the world than anything before that. So it is this notion of being in service to the restoration or application of the Indigenous knowledge system into Western context, with the fusion of that through this notion of culture reciprocity. Like I deal with this with the Maori and with Aboriginal Australians, and what does how does well, you think about the complex community and systems relationships that were here before Western contact, and how the whole country was managed through this complex system. There's so much to learn from that. And I first started getting glimpses of that with Jared Diamond's work, and in particular his book, The World Until Yesterday, which looked at, the core elements of family dispute resolution, food systems, child rearing in Indigenous context versus Western context. And there's a blending of that in some ways Indigenous, ways of doing that were better, and actually training, the lineage of generations of kids coming up and learning not about competition, but of collaboration, cooperation. There's something in there about like kids in Indonesia or Papua New Guinea, and they're in preschool, they each get a banana and they have to slice the banana up and each give a piece to everyone else in the classroom. But at the end of the exercise, everyone still has the whole banana, but the whole banana was given to them by someone else, right? Does that make sense? Yeah. So yeah, we teach Western, competition, and so there's this whole different thing in there around that. But that Indigenous knowledge can inform a different type of indigenomics, a different economics model, but has lore, kinship, and connection to country, and that land, what Anne would say, land is law. So that notion that we belong to the earth, and how that mindset informs the economic model, that's huge. I can't pretend to create that without, as a white dude from New York, but I know the people out there that, coming to, if we bring those two things together, something really special can get created. And there is some of that with happening with Kate Rayworth's work. I posted that thing with Maori interpretation of economics. Those are glimpses of where we can go.
Yeah. And so what you're doing with this the Common Earth project and the road mapping, bringing that to Australia as well, this is part of, I guess, trying to get those conversations together, get those thought leaders together, get those different perspectives together. So where are you hoping we might go with that? Tell us a little bit about the Common Earth. How do you describe it? It's a Common Earth project or a Common Earth? What's the terminology?
Common Earth the Common Earth is an initiative of the Commonwealth. So the Commonwealth of Nations represents 54 countries on the planet and probably about 2.7 billion people. It's interesting, I guess the context of Commonwealth being the epicenter of imperialism, going back in European expansion and colonization of the world. And I think there's some relevance to the understanding of Western views and Western mindsets around land management, governance, and economics have dominated the human story in the last, 100 years. And what that's done to create the crises we're dealing with now, the human-induced challenges. And sustainability is a very Western contrived concept as well. So I've learned that. And it goes back so much farther than us. So Common Earth is set up to help the Commonwealth look at regenerative development as a model or a pathway to reverse global warming, right? To create planetary health and leverage their influence with world leaders, politics, policies. I mean, they were the ones that adopted the SDGs before the SDGs were ratified by the UN, so there's influence there. Drawing on culture, First Nations people, so Indigenous knowledge is right in the heart of that work, so that we listen and learn of how it was done before contact and before Western influence came, involved in place. But each country needs to have, a group of people that help steward that work. We have a great group of people doing stuff in New Zealand. There's already work being done in Costa Rica with an incredible group of people there. And I've just, I've met some incredible and been grateful to connect with some beautiful people here in Australia that I saw as having the right hearts and minds and training and understanding of the world and themselves and of this place to be the custodians of that work here. Having the right sensibility, the right way of working, the right way of engaging with First Nations people, having First Nations leading this work. It's also very matriarchal, because that's another hugely important role in the future as women leadership and decision making and guidance of how humanity corrects itself. So it's 90% women. I think the stewardship group is 100% women and 50% Indigenous. I think that, I just know to stay out of it as a white guy, a privileged white male from the East Coast of America. I know to stay out of it. I just know to nurture and then walk away and let it grow how it needs to grow from the people that are around it. Because I've only been here 7 years as a guest, and I can't pretend to know the deep history and knowledge of this place or growing up here. That's hugely important to how this work evolves. And I know there's incredible women who have raised their hand, who are committed to seeing something happen and determined to see something happen. So that will help shepherd this process through with some support from a global working group of the Common Earth to help.
And you're about to head off on a new adventure, I hear.
I am. It's very daunting, but I'm heading off to Doha, Qatar, to work for the Qatar Foundation, who has a mission to use research, science, community development, and education as a way to transform the economy of Qatar and support Qatari people in shifting away from a carbon-based society to a knowledge-based and hopefully regenerative society, if that's fathomable. The mindset of seeing the Middle East as the oil barrel and the geopolitical crisis center of the world, there's something inherently special about a culture of people trying to regenerate its own culture and craft an economy based on that culture that is committed to environmental regeneration, education, peace, tolerance, diversity. And it's interesting because I have a lot to learn about Islam religion, about Sharia law. So I'm going in there very respectfully in service to Qatari people. So I'm doing what I've been trained to do, of how to get into a system and learn it, respect it, understand it, see its opportunity potential. But I get to work on incredible work for the World Cup and look at the role of sports in helping create peace and health and regeneration. And beyond that, an organization that's literally shaping a national strategy and trajectory to move away from fossil fuels. And the resources to do it. So I feel very privileged and lucky to work with and go into a new part of the world, and embrace a new culture, learn about it, learn about the place, and share my experience in a way that can be helpful. Same thing I tried to do here.
Yeah.
It's just slower.
Well, I acknowledge that you need to head off. You have other things that you need to do this morning in your incredibly full life as you get prepared to head on that journey. Thanks so much.
I have to reverse interview you because I like next week, I think, or the week after we're doing this.
Yeah, that's right.
I have so much to learn from you, and I'm excited that we got to connect, but it's like we're at the last hour of my life in Australia, but it's not going to be the end of our relationship, because I know you're hugely important to this movement and to this region and globally, because your expertise and the lineage of knowledge that you've been holding from the pioneers of permaculture, and so important. We need permaculture, so.
And likewise, I feel there's an important connection between the work that you're doing. I'm really inspired by to be part of the initiatives that you've brought and activated here in Australia, and I feel that it's a really important way to kind of leverage the imperative that is now to bring these regenerative solutions that exist into the fore and to help make the change that we need to see in the world right now, and to activate regenerative education, regenerative agriculture, regenerative cities and planning and culture and thinking. It's a shift, and I think it feels like it's ready, and I think this moment now is so important. It feels like there's been a crack. There's sort of something like been peeled back, and we have an opportunity now to really to help to fill that space with a different kind of thinking. And I'm always forever hopeful, because I know on the other side of that is a huge amount of challenges and pushback as well. So, but I like to stay on the hopeful side. And
I'd say it's your destiny to be part of this group for the Common Earth, because you've committed your life to this work, and you deserve to be involved in how this work evolves. And it's like, it's perfect. It's perfect union of minds. So
yeah,
I'm excited to see where it goes.
Me too. Well, thank you so much, Jason, and I'll let you get on with your day of regenerating the world. So thanks for tuning in to the Sense Making in a Changing World podcast today. It's been a real pleasure to have your company. I invite you to subscribe and receive notification of each new weekly episode with more wonderful stories, ideas, inspiration, and common sense for living and working regeneratively, and call positive permaculture thinking and design into action in this changing world. I'm including a transcript below and a link also to my 4-part permaculture series, really looking at what is permaculture and how to make it your livelihood too. So join me again in the next episode, where we talk with another fascinating guest. I look forward to seeing you there.